We've seen that phonemes have allophones, and that these allophones depend in part on the situation that the particular phoneme finds itself in. It might be thought that this is a random process, but it obviously isn't, because otherwise we couldn't write rules to show how the process works. In this session we're going to have a look at some of the systematic processes by which phonemes become particular kinds of allophones. We're going to look at aspiration, the process whereby a stop gains a puff of air after it, the process of assimilation where a sound becomes more like its neighbours, taking on one or more of the attributes of its neighbours, elision, the process whereby a phoneme ends up having no allophone at all, and insertion, where, although there isn't a phoneme there, some kind of phonetic material is inserted into the sequence. The IPA handles this kind of phenomenon by using diacritics. If you look at the top left-hand cell in the IPA diacritics chart, which of course is also in the textbook and on the IPA website, you'll see that there are two sounds there, n and d, the nasal and the voiced stop, that are pronounced on the alveolar ridge. You'll see that both of them have a little circle underneath. Well, the sounds themselves are both voiced. N is voiced and D is also voiced, but in this case it says that they're voiceless. How can that be true? Well, the suggestion of the IPA is that underlyingly the N is normally voiced, but it becomes voiceless in a particular situation. That's how diacritics generally are used. Some of them you will already be familiar with. We've looked at nasal release and lateral release, but there's a whole lot more here that if you were to become a phonetician by profession, then you'd learn all of them. Let's start with aspiration. All voiceless stops are aspirated when they come first in a stressed syllable. Well, we can write a rule for that. We can say that P, T and K are realized as their aspirated allophones in a situation where they come before a vowel and where the syllable in which they appear is stressed. You'll notice that this is a systematic relationship. It doesn't apply to one phoneme, but it applies to a whole class of phonemes, and these phonemes have particular features. Namely, all of them are voiceless, all of them are stops, and all of them are oral stops. In fact, these three are the only voiceless oral stops in English. So instead of applying to individual phonemes, this rule applies to a class of phonemes. And if we look at these properties of voicelessness, being oral and being a stop, you'll see that they are distinctive in English. It matters whether a sound is voiced or not. It matters whether it's oral or nasal, and it matters whether it's a stop or a fricative. These are distinctive features. Now to assimilation. Assimilation happens when a phonetic property in one sound carries over onto the next one, or is presupposed because the following one is going to have that property. And there are a number of different kinds of assimilation. Some sounds change their place of articulation because of what one of the neighbouring sounds does. Some change their voicing. Some become nasalized. Others change their lip attitude. The lips might be rounded or spread normally, but move to the other position depending on the sounds that are on either side. And finally, there's a process where two sounds are fused, creating a third. Obviously, since sounds come out of our mouths one at a time, one behind the other, the direction of the assimilation is interesting. Which sound is it that influences the one that is undergoing a change? There are progressive assimilations where a sound takes on the phonetic property of another sound which comes before it. In other words, the phonetic property sticks around for a little bit longer. The opposite situation is where a sound, if you like, thinks about what it is that's coming and takes on the phonetic property of a sound that hasn't happened yet. These are called regressive or anticipatory assimilation. We can now illustrate both of these, the different types of assimilation and the direction in which they operate. Let's start by looking at place assimilation. If you think of the word uncomfortable and pronounce it very slowly, the first consonant is N, uncomfortable. But if you pronounce it at normal speed, you'd normally say uncomfortable. What's happened here? The N phoneme is pronounced as ng. What that means is it's changed its place of articulation. It was an alveolar, normally, and maybe elsewhere, but in this circumstance it's pronounced as a velar. Why is its place of articulation a velar? Not too hard to seek. The following consonant is itself a velar. K is a velar consonant. So, if you like, N is anticipating the velar to come and is changing its place of articulation accordingly. So this is an anticipatory assimilation. What about this situation? Here we've got an S at the end of the word, hurts. In this one, the spelling tells us it's an S, but we've got heads. This is actually a Z phoneme and not a S phoneme. Z rather than S. Looks, S. Legs, Z. Is this sound voiced or voiceless? Well, it depends. In the first and the third word, it's voiceless, and in the second and fourth word, it's voiced. Why is that? Well, this time we have to look at the preceding sound because there isn't one after. So, T is voiceless, D is voiced, K is voiceless, and G is voiced. Voicing assimilation has taken place, and in this case the direction is progressive. The sound before the sound in question has, if you like, donated its voicing property to the following sound. Try it. Cads, D voiced followed by Z. What about devoicing? Can we get sounds where the original sound is normally voiced but it loses its voice? Here's a case. If this were just the word rush, R-U-S-H, rush, the first consonant, R, would be voiced, rush. But now let's have a look at it after K, crush, crush, cr. That second R, second consonant in, isn't voiced at all. It has lost its voice. Why has it lost its voice? Well, the K sound in front is also voiceless, so it's taken on the voicing properties of the preceding sound, and so we have a voiceless R. Now you would think that was impossible. Why don't people have problems with this? Why do they know that this is an R? Well, they know the rules of the language, and the rules of the language say that if you have an R following a K, then it loses its voice. Given that you know that rule, you can put the voicing back in your brain and say, well, this is actually the phoneme R, because we know that there's a rule that devoices R's after K. Nasalization. Vowels can become nasalized when there is a nasal consonant following them. Why would that be? Well, if there's a nasal to follow, then the velum is going to be lowered. What it does is it lowers a little bit early while the vowel is still in progress, and that gives the vowel a different quality. Listen carefully to the vowel in long, long, o, o. This isn't o, this is o. It's nasalized. Those of you who have learnt French or who speak French will know that there are a lot of nasalized vowels in French, and in some cases there's no nasal there at all? Well, there was, and that's how a number of nasalized vowels came to be nasalized. So some of these processes are historical as well as contemporary. So what's the rule? The rule says, here's a little tilde indicating nasalization. Place it over the vowel if the vowel comes before a nasal. The capital N indicates nasal. You'll notice that the tilde has flown off a bit. It must be a windy day. Occasionally, and this doesn't happen all that often, two sound segments get together. One donates some of its features to the other and vice versa because they're near neighbours, if you like. They move in together, having been in neighbouring apartments. Let's have a look at the word education. Education, said very slowly and very formally. Phonemically, this is education, but said normally it becomes education. The D phoneme and the Y phoneme together become the J allophone. This is itself a single sound in English, J, and it's made up partly of the D and partly of the Y, but the Y has been altered to become a J. Well, let's have a look at another situation. It's a situation we've already met when we were looking at spelling. Are there segments which you would normally omit? Who says handsome? Handsome. We don't actually say that normally. We say handsome. The D disappears. We say windmill. Windmill. We don't usually say windmill. We can, but we don't. Handkerchief becomes handkerchief, first of all by being handkerchief. Then the D disappears, and then the N in handkerchief comes before the K and becomes the NG sound, handkerchief. So some of these processes carry on and create room for other processes. Mostly, the T is often not pronounced. So this is called elision. Something is left out. Elided. Now again, there isn't a problem here because in many cases we know what it was that got left out, if you like, and so sometimes we could say, well, there was a phoneme there, but its allophone is nothing at all. Let's have a look at the opposite situation where something is inserted. A lot of children say athlete, athlete. Between the th and the l, there isn't a vowel in the spelling of the word, but when it's said, for at least some speakers, a vowel is inserted. Some people say film. The L and the M are being broken apart and a vowel phoneme is put in the middle, or at least maybe a vowel allophone. This is called epenthesis or insertion, and that also happens quite often. So what happens in summary? There's frequently quite a distance between the phonological representation, if you like, the sound spelling of a word in your head, and what comes out of your mouth when you say the word. All sorts of allophonic processes are at work in creating allophones of various sorts that change the phonetic character that you might expect into one that is conditioned by the circumstances, the phonetic circumstances in which that sound occurs. And notice that many different processes can be involved.